Good morning. This is a introduction to the Babson course. What we're going to do is we're going to go over some of the general things that will be covered. One of the things that will be covered in the Babson course is a technique called VRMM. And VRMM is virtual reality market mapping. And what the big difference between VRMM and Elliott wave is Elliott wave looks at a chart and will and is actually forced to label these different swings, different things, and sometimes people have to sit there and somehow figure out what kind of a label to put at each of the different pivots. Now, VRMM isn't concerned about that. VRMM simply does measurements. It does measurements, and it says, and so your measurement is either true or it isn't true. And measurements is not in the Fibonacci sense. We do not use Fibonacci. Just be clear on that, even though you can. Now, so what happens is in the VRMM model, it does measurements. And it'll say, well, this is true, and this is true, and this isn't true. So, for example, up here, this would be considered a J pivot, and this would be considered a J pivot, and this would be considered a J pivot, because certain things occurred in this area here, and here, and here, that typically occur at J pivots. And this here, for example, is a J minus 1. This is a J minus 1. And this is a J minus 1. Actually, this is it here. Yeah. This is a J minus 1 because certain things occur at J minus 1 pivots. And then you have J plus 1 and J plus 2. And you don't necessarily have a J plus 4, 5, 6, or 7, any of those kind of things. So that wouldn't make sense. But the idea being that before a major pivot, a J pivot, certain things occur, and after a major pivot, certain things occur. And these are measurable. And so if we can measure these things, we can, and we know where we are, or we have a pretty good idea where we are, we can then forecast with better accuracy. Now, you can use this in conjunction with Elliott wave, but you will not give yourself a headache trying to figure out what these different points are and how they should be labeled. Because if you have 10 people in the room using Elliott wave, there's a chance that they might label a chart differently. They might take this whole chart here and label all these pivots here differently. Whereas if you get 10 people using this Babson technique, they all have to label it the same because it uses the same measurement tools. Okay, so one of the things that Babson, of course, used was action reaction, and the absolute favorite of the action reaction techniques from Dr. Alan Andrews was something called the ORE. And what he believed is that with the ORE, you have a very high probability of finding the end of the move. And since it is an action reaction technique, it gives you the opportunity to draw several lines where those reactions are likely to occur. What has happened is done some research since then and found that we can determine that pretty easily, and on pretty much a cookie cutter basis, so it's not as willy-nilly, because Andrews might use this point here and 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 this point here, whereas the way I use these and the way I show you how I use them is much more limited. The same thing with Newton lines. If you draw what I call the Newton action reaction lines, which were probably the favorite of Roger Babson, then you would also come out with this value down here. Okay, and one of the things that's really important in the VRMM technique is watching for what I call Christmas tree patterns. And a Christmas tree pattern is when a market goes vertical. Here's a nice example of a market going vertical. And quite often when you have the market going vertical, like this example here, you have the market going up to a course line. And then it is generally a good idea to seriously consider taking profits, all or at least some, because the market has a tendency, as we can see here with perfect 2020 hindsight, to reverse after making one of these things here. Now the Christmas tree in itself isn't necessarily part of the VRMM model, but it is something that we like to look for. So if you get this, if you see this kind of a situation, then it goes up to a point where prices are likely to have a J pivot, then it is generally a good idea to take profits. Okay, so what we're looking for is things in this area here. If this is a J pivot, and this is a J pivot, and this is a J pivot, then we're looking at this here as being J minus 1, J minus 1, J minus 1. And show you something fairly obvious. Notice that, and this is not unusual, that at the J minus 1, it's higher than previous pivots. See that? See how your J minus 1 here is higher than the previous pivots? Okay, and that's not unusual. Ironically, there's a lot of investors that get very confused when this kind of thing happens, and then the market goes and makes new lows. It just happens. So there are many characteristics for the J minus 1, many characteristics for the J minus 2, and J plus 1 and J plus 2. And J plus 2s are often very interesting points to enter the market on, as are J points. It really depends on what evidence there is that tells you that the market is turning here or here, and also what the market is likely to do next based upon other factors that we know at this point in time. So like I said, if you do get prices going vertical crazy like they are over here, then it's probably a good idea to look at the idea of taking profits. Okay, so if this is a J, if you have the evidence necessary that this is a J point here, and one of the things you're looking at is this point here, did prices do what they need to do at a J minus 1? Okay, and so those are the things that you consider in the VRMM technology, and that's how it differs from Elliott wave. And you can combine it with Elliott wave. It's just but you won't get the same headaches that you do with Elliott wave, because you don't have to label every pivot. You simply label what you see. And there's going to be a lot of pivots that you simply don't label with the VRMM technique because they don't meet the qualifications. All right. So what we do is we go over what typically happens at a J, what typically happens at a J minus 1, and what typically happens at a J plus 1 and at a J plus 2, and then we go over a whole bunch of other things. Most importantly, how to calculate the different things, including the ORE, how to calculate the Newton, and how to use the specific action points rather than every single reaction point in sight, so that you're not concerned with all these little pivots in between, the way Andrews was. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with being interested in all these pivots in between. They're great for day traders. Just some people prefer to be in a position for a longer period of time, and this is then useful for them. I thank you for your time. If you get a chance, take the Babson course. A good way to get started with this, if you've never done any type of market geometry, is the Andrews course. And we have a special right now, and it is that if you take the Andrews course and within 90 days decide to upgrade, we have something special in store for you, and we'll even give you full credit for whatever you paid for the Andrews course. Okay, So thank you for your time. Please go to andrewscourse.com to order. Thanks. Bye.